Today we're going to talk about how to simplify square roots. And simplifying square roots, you're just trying to figure out a way of making the number that's inside that radical symbol there into a smaller number. So let's look here. First of all, you need to understand something. This is just an example of how to work this. So if you imagine radical 4 times radical 16. Radical 4 is, what's the square root of 4? 2. Radical 16, what's the square root of 16? 4. I can multiply those two together after I simplify the radicals by finding their square roots, and then I end up with 8. Or alternatively, I can do this. Radical 4 times radical 16. When I multiply 4 times 16, I get 64. They both, after you multiply them, can stay underneath that radical symbol. And then you just take the square root of 64, which is 8. So if I look here, radical 5 times radical 20. That's going to be radical 100. So what's the square root of 100? That's just going to be plain old 10. So if you want to, you can multiply things together if they're both under radical symbols. So if I wanted to, I could take radical 20 times radical 3, and that would equal to radical 60. If I wanted to do, I could do radical 100 times radical 8, and then that would be equal to radical 800. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Just you can multiply things that are under the same radical, or the same type of radical. Now where simplifying radicals comes out, we're going to, instead of multiply, we're going to divide out some things. So this one here, radical 300, I can change this into radical 3 times radical 100. Now why would I choose radical 3 and radical 100? The reason why I choose that is that radical 100, I know the answer to that. That's going to be 10. What's the square root of 100? 10. Radical 3 I can't do anything with. So this is essentially going to be radical 3 times 10. The way we write that, it's going to be 10 in front times radical 3. So let's say we have a new problem, radical 12. I'm looking for a way of using one of those perfect square numbers. And I just wrote the perfect square numbers in green on the right hand side. So how can I make a multiplication problem that involves one of these numbers? Well, I can do it by using 4. So it's going to be radical 4 times radical 3, because when I multiply those two together, I'm going to end up with radical 12. Radical 4, the square root of 4 is 2, so it's just going to be 2 radical 3. That's the simplified version of that radical. So let's say I have this number here, radical 32. I'm going to change that into the biggest number I know that is a perfect square. In this case here, that's going to be radical 16 times radical 2. Radical 16 is going to end up being 4, because the square root of 16 is 4. 4 radical 2 is the answer. Okay, so now we're going to add some variables to it. So think of this as two separate problems. This I can break apart into radical 200 times radical x squared. So think about it for a moment. What's the square root of x squared? That's just going to be plain old x. So now I just have to figure out this part here. It's going to be radical 200 is going to change into radical 100 times radical 2. Radical 100 is just going to be 10, because the square root of 100 is 10. Radical 2 is left over. And then I've got to remember to put that x there. So the answer, the final answer for this is going to be 10. Then I have x because that I took the square root of. I got rid of this part here. I got rid of this part here. 10 and x, and now the remaining part on the inside is going to be radical 2. Now there's also a property having to do with quotients or division problems. This problem here, I can simplify into this. Radical 36 over radical 25. So what's radical 36? That's just 6. What's radical 25? That's just 5. So I'm just breaking them apart into two separate problems and then simplifying them. So let's say I have this problem, radical z over 64. I can again break it apart, radical z over radical 64. So I can't do anything with the z. If it was z squared, I could, but it's just plain old radical z. It stays that way. What's the square root of 64? That's just going to be 8.